You're watching Live Now. I'm Austin Westfall. Pentagon correspondent Jennifer Griffin with the latest on the U.S. as it considers its options in Iran.
They better negotiate a fair deal.
President Trump is doubling down on his warning against Iran, saying an agreement needs to be reached over its nuclear program. Following comments, he is considering military strikes against the country.
They cannot have a nuclear weapon. The president has been very clear on that.
According to a report from Reuters, two anonymous officials say some of the planning by the U.S. military involves options to target individuals in Iran and possibly even pursue a regime change in the country. Trump's warning comes even as Iran's foreign minister says officials are planning to finish a drafted deal and send it to Washington, though, he adds, there will never be a military solution for Iran's nuclear program.
The only solution is diplomacy. We are prepared for diplomacy and we are prepared for negotiation as much as we are prepared for war.
Tehran holding drills with Russia this week as a U.S. aircraft carrier, the world's largest, passed through the Strait of Gibraltar and entered the Mediterranean Sea on Friday, a move that most likely takes away from an element of surprise by the U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio is expected to visit Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu in Israel next week to discuss those U.S.-Iran talks. In Washington, Jennifer Griffin, Fox News.
Let's bring in retired Marine Intelligence Officer, National Security Analyst, and the host of the Strat podcast, Hal Kempfer, here with me. You know, we've been looking at this map throughout the week. You can see the assets that have built up in the area, and this is not even including what Jennifer Griffin was just talking about there, the Gerald R. Ford, which just crossed through the Strait of Gibraltar, on its way to the area as well. You know, this week, Hal, Iran and U.S. officials have been holding indirect diplomatic negotiations. Indirect. But it doesn't feel like those talks have calmed the situation down. Obviously, a large amount of manpower in the region. Does it feel like to you that the U.S. is poised to do something militarily, regardless of how recent negotiations have played out?
Also, what it looks like is we're putting all the assets into place to do a major operation. We've got, I mean, you see the ships that we have poised around there, and those aren't exact locations, of course, but what you also don't see is a number of AWACS aircraft and other, significant aviation control birds, if you will, planes that can really control a lot of dynamic aerial combat. And then you don't see the F-18s, the F-15s, the F-22s, other F-35s in various different airfields around the Gulf that are within striking distance. So there's a lot going on there. Now, we've seen a tremendous amount of tankers coming in, which tells me we're looking at sustaining a lot of planes for a very long period of time. And it also provides an ability to do things like if we want to bring in bombers like B-2 bombers, they would have to have tanker support. And there's just been a tremendous amount of cargo aircraft coming in, with most of the speculation being that it's carrying a lot of stuff tied to air defense, really stuff that can thwart that missile threat that we get from Iran, but also things that might be able to thwart, for example, the drone threat and other things. So there's a lot going in there. But even with all that firepower, if we hit Iran, they're going to be able to respond. And they have a lot of capabilities to do that. And they can cause some great disruption, not just with us from a military standpoint, but also from a commercial standpoint by clogging up the Strait of Hormuz with a variety of different assets and means.
So the U.S. nabbed Maduro, and they did that with really a pinpoint operation, you could call it. Can you compare the complexity of that mission to a hypothetical mission that would involve getting to the Ayatollah?
Yeah, that was a lot easier mission. As complex as the one in Venezuela was, and I don't want to take away from all the stuff that went there, that was tremendous planning. There were some capabilities that just completely overwhelmed the Venezuelans. Geography has rules of its own, and the geography in Iran is vastly different than the geography in Venezuela. Tehran is well inland. It's not something we can easily access from the sea. And even if we were to go in there and, say, capture Khomeini, which would be much, much more difficult than it was to capture Maduro, that would not necessarily change things. There is a regime, a structure around him that would remain intact. It's not clear that would certainly cause a cessation of military strikes from Iran to all the neighbors. In fact, it might actually pick up the op tempo on that. So there's really there isn't a way to compare those two other than say we have tremendous capabilities. Now, one thing I would point out is special operations. And when I looked at that big flow of cargo aircraft, maybe we're not bringing in large troop formations, lots of tanks, things like that. But I would be really surprised if there wasn't a lot of special operators with some special equipment that will allow us to do some things. And keep in mind, we've seen that. We saw what the Israelis did. They had covert operatives actually operating in Iran. And I would imagine that we are looking at that. We may actually even be coordinating with Israel on that.
We have been tracking, and by the way, a live look at the White House, the time in the nation's capital approaching 5:15. It was Reuters that first reported last week that the U.S. military is preparing for a sustained weeks-long operation against Iran that could include striking Iranian security facilities as well as nuclear infrastructure. Hal, the U.S. did strike Iran last year. That operation took hours. Why might we be talking about weeks this time around?
Well, to really create the conditions we want, if we really want to create regime change, if we really want to neutralize the capabilities Iran has and really go after those nuclear capabilities, the enriched uranium, and any capability they have to enrich uranium, we're going to have to be there for a while. We're going to have to hit targets over and over again. We're going to have multiple strikes. And then we're going to want to do one thing, which is take out their ballistic missile capability and their drone capability. That's not something we're going to easily make happen in a single, short multi-hour thing. That's going to take days and weeks to put in place. To really accomplish the end state that we seem to be aimed at, it's going to take consistent, overwhelming firepower. That's also something to degrade the, revolution or the IRGC, the Revolutionary Guard Corps, and other elements of the regime to the point where potentially protesters could hit the streets and have enough, capability to actually start taking over buildings and doing those things necessary to actually affect regime change.
Some images from some of the protests that you could very easily argue began this current round of negotiations. It was these protests, and ultimately something President Trump alluded to earlier today was the killing of tens of thousands of protesters, according to Trump, that really got the ball rolling on these most recent round of discussions. Again, it was in Geneva earlier this week that we heard that a U.S. envoy and Iranian officials were meeting indirectly to discuss this. I want to talk about another state, Russia. Iran and Russia, Hal, have been conducting joint military drills this week. Let's say that the U.S. does do something militarily in Iran. How tight is Russia with Iran, and is there a threshold at which Russia would be compelled to get involved?
I don't see that. I'm not ruling it out, but of course I saw the joint exercise they did. I think that was really for deterrence value. Russia does things like that. You may recall when we took the I think it was the Bella 2 tanker in the North Atlantic, when the UK and us did a joint VBSS boarding operation to seize the tanker. That prior to that, there were reports a Russian submarine and one or two Russian Navy ships had come up along there as a deterrence to any potential U.S.-led boarding effort. And when it was clear that we're going to do it, they disappeared. And Russia just doesn't have the capability to project power into Iran to do much of anything. So I think there's a lot of symbolism there. I think they're trying to show support. But for Russia, Iran is a very important partner. They're the ones that are providing Shahed drones, although Russia does actually manufacture those in Russia itself. But all the components, all the pipeline for the things that are necessary to make that, and a variety of other things, those come from Iran. So if Iran was taken out as a strategic ally of Russia, and then you saw they lost Syria as an ally, they start running out of Middle Eastern countries. Well, they frankly ran out of Middle Eastern countries that they can look to as allies, and then they can't project any power in the region or significant power in the region. So it'd be a real setback for Russia.
So let's kind of just talk about what might happen in Iran. Let's say that the U.S. were compelled to trigger an regime change in Iran. What implications would that have on Iran, and what implication would that have on Iran's neighbors and the wider Middle East?
Well, if there was regime change, and there are multiple scenarios of what that could look like. I mean, it could be, the theocracy, Khomeini, and those around him leave, but the IRGC is still in place. Okay, so you got the Revolutionary Guard Corps. Maybe they take over. Is that going to be a more radical regime or a less radical regime? Would that really change the trajectory of the country? Don't know. There's thoughts that maybe there's the more normative political side with the regular military and the regular police force takes over. That would be regime change. But again, would that be a pro-U.S. regime? I don't know. And then what we'd like to see, of course, is a pro-democracy type regime change. That's obviously optimal in that. But in all those, in the case of the last one, if we get a pro-Western, pro-U.S. Regime, not necessarily a democracy, but on the road to democracy, that would completely shift the dynamic in the Middle East. All of a sudden, Hezbollah, Hamas, the Shiite extremist paramilitary groups in Iraq, the Houthis, no longer have a primary backer. They're basically cut off from all the stuff that they're getting from them. And right now, certainly with Hamas and Hezbollah, they're facing, pretty strong headwinds saying you have to disarm and you have to quit being a terrorist group and you have to stop your governance role or trying to be in a governance role. That's huge. The Houthis would have to figure out, okay, where do we go from here? We no longer have our benefactor. How long can we sustain these operations that we're doing here in the Horn of Africa? There'd be a huge change there. And then obviously it would open the floodgates for probably expansion of the Abraham Accords. There's just a lot of interesting things. And then China, they get a lot of oil. They import about 11 million barrels a day of oil. Much of that does come from Iran. They all of a sudden wouldn't have a secure conduit of oil going from Iran to China. Now, doesn't mean they're going to get cut off from all the oil. Doesn't mean that they may not negotiate something where they can get Iranian oil in the future. But it does change the position of where they are now as opposed to where they could be.
You and I have been tracking these reports closely all week, and information does change as the days tick by. Some of the reporting I've seen from certain outlets say that a strike could come within days. Some news outlets are saying that something could come as soon as this weekend. If history is any indicator, Hal, would information like that be leaking to the media if, in fact, something actually were planned as soon as this weekend or in the coming days? Would they let something like that get out?
Well, some of it may be speculation. Some of it may be strategic deception. Keep them guessing. And certainly we have done that in the past. We did that with the Midnight Hammer thing. We're trying, it's like, we want to talk, we want to negotiate, we want to work this, and then boom, we hit them. All right. So I kind of look at where all the forces are arrayed. It's right now the Gerald R. Ford, the carrier task force is moving, just crossed the Straits of Gibraltar today, moving across the Mediterranean. It has its escorts with it. It's moving about 18, 19 knots from what I understand. And part of the reason is so the escorts can keep up, but they also have heavy seas. And if the escorts try to go faster, they'd not only burn up a lot of fuel, but they'd also probably take some damage and injuries and stuff on board the ships. So they're going to move at that pace. That's going to take a while to get there. And then if they want to move it from the Eastern Mediterranean into the Arabian Sea, then it's got to transit to the Suez Canal. It's got to go past where the Houthis are. It's got to do a lot of things. That takes time. So most people are thinking somewhere closer to the middle of March, everything will be in place that we could do something. And I'm kind of leaning towards thinking this weekend, a little too soon. Next week, possible, but there's a lot of compromises in terms of where everything is. But if you start pushing it out 2 weeks and into 3 weeks, then everything's in place. And that kind of lowers the risk, if you will, strategic risk of launching the operation.
President Trump's State of the Union speech is going to be on Tuesday. It'll be interesting to see if he discusses what he says about Iran, I should say. Not if he discusses it. We anticipate he will discuss the Middle East during his speech. What exactly he says Tuesday night, we'll see if that gives us any indication of where things are heading. Hal is a national security analyst, retired Marine intelligence officer, and the host of the Strat podcast. The latest episode of Strat is about Iran, correct, Hal?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I kind of go much more in depth. And I kind of lay out the strategic implications of what's happening and what could happen if we go in, and, that kind of second, third order effects thing, what we were alluding to earlier.
All right. We'll see you soon, Hal. Appreciate you.